The moment that almost made Reba McEntire quit music. The stage lights dimmed to a haunting amber glow as Sarah Jennings clutched the microphone with trembling hands, her heart hammering so violently she was certain the entire auditorium could hear it echoing through the speakers. 24 years old, with calloused fingers from years of guitar playing, and eyes that held the desperate hunger of someone who had risked everything for a single moment, she stood before the most important judges' panel of her life. The Nashville Music Hall buzzed with an electric tension that made her skin crawl with anticipation and terror, in equal measure. This was not just another audition. This was the Golden Note Country Music Competition, the most prestigious talent search in the industry, where careers were born and dreams either soared to unimaginable heights or crashed and burned in spectacular fashion. Winners walked away with recording contracts, nationwide tours, and the kind of fame that transformed small-town nobodies into household names overnight. Losers disappeared back into the shadows of honky-tonk bars and dusty backroads, their hopes crushed beneath the brutal weight of rejection. Sarah had traveled over 800 miles from Millerville, Texas, a town so small it barely registered on most maps, where the population of 3,000 souls knew every secret, every scandal, and every broken dream that had ever dared to sprout in their sun-baked streets. She had worked double shifts at Murphy's Bar and Grill for 3 years, serving beer to ranchers and oil workers by day, then climbing onto the tiny stage each night to pour her heart out through songs that spoke of heartbreak, resilience, and the kind of raw truth that only came from living life with calloused hands and an unbreakable spirit. Every dollar she had earned, every tip stuffed into mason jars hidden beneath her bed, every sacrifice she had made while her friends got married and started families, had led to this single moment. The bus ticket to Nashville had cost her 2 weeks of groceries. The cheap hotel room had eaten through her savings like wildfire. But none of that mattered now, because standing on this stage meant everything she had ever wanted was within reach. The panel of judges sat like gods in the darkness beyond the stage lights, their faces obscured by shadows that made them seem both omnipotent and terrifying. But Sarah knew who they were. Marcus Holloway, the legendary producer whose golden touch had launched a dozen superstars into the stratosphere of fame. Rebecca Morrison, the sharp-tongued music executive whose approval could open doors that remained forever locked to most aspiring artists. And Dr. William Hughes, the music professor whose technical expertise could dissect a performance with surgical precision. If you're watching this story unfold with us tonight, we'd love to know where you're tuning in from around the world. Drop a comment below and let us know what you think about Sarah's journey so far. Your support means everything to storytellers like us, and we can't wait to hear your thoughts as this incredible tale continues to unfold. Sarah adjusted the strap of her worn guitar, a battered acoustic instrument that had belonged to her grandmother, its wood polished smooth by decades of loving hands and countless songs. The instrument had been her constant companion through lonely nights and impossible dreams, and now it would either carry her to stardom or witness her final defeat. She had chosen to perform an original song, a risky decision that could either showcase her unique voice or expose her inexperience to the unforgiving scrutiny of industry veterans. The song was called Dusty Roads and Broken Dreams, a haunting ballad that told the story of her hometown, where young people fled as soon as they could drive, and old dreams lay buried beneath years of resignation and compromise. It was deeply personal, drawn from her own experience of watching friends abandon their aspirations for the safety of predictable lives, while she had chosen the terrifying uncertainty of chasing something that might never come. Marcus Holloway leaned back in his chair, his expensive suit immaculate despite the late hour, his dark eyes scanning Sarah with the cold calculation of a predator sizing up prey. At 45 years old, he had built his reputation on an uncanny ability to spot talent and transform raw potential into commercial gold. But he had also earned a darker reputation for his brutal honesty and his willingness to crush dreams without hesitation if he deemed them unworthy of his time. Sarah began to play, her fingers finding the familiar chord progression that had carried her through countless nights of practice in her tiny apartment above Murphy's Bar. The melody was simple but haunting, built on the kind of emotional foundation that had made country music the voice of working-class America for generations. Her voice, clear and strong despite her nerves, began to weave the story of a young woman who refused to let her circumstances define her destiny, But as she reached the chorus, something in Marcus Holloway's expression shifted. His eyes narrowed with a mixture of disdain and irritation, as if Sarah's performance was somehow personally offensive to him. He leaned forward, his fingers drumming impatiently on the table, and Sarah felt her confidence beginning to crack under the weight of his obvious disapproval. The other judges seemed engaged, even impressed, but Marcus's reaction was becoming increasingly hostile with each passing verse. Sarah pushed through her nervousness, determined to finish her song despite the growing tension that seemed to fill the auditorium like smoke. She had come too far and sacrificed too much to let one man's disapproval derail her dream. When she finished the song, the auditorium fell into a silence so complete that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. The other judges exchanged glances, clearly moved by her performance, but Marcus was already shaking his head with the kind of dismissive contempt that could shatter years of preparation in seconds. Rebecca Morrison opened her mouth to speak, her expression suggesting she was about to offer praise, but Marcus cut her off with a sharp gesture that commanded immediate attention. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Before we go any further," Marcus said, his tone dripping with condescension, "I need to understand something about your musical influences. Who do you consider your primary inspiration as an artist?" The question seemed innocent enough, but Sarah sensed the trap hidden beneath its surface. Still, she had no choice but to answer honestly, because lying would be worse than whatever judgment awaited her truth. She straightened her shoulders, drawing strength from the memory of her grandmother's guitar in her hands and the faces of everyone back home who believed in her dream. "Reba McEntire," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear that was beginning to coil in her stomach like a snake. "She's been my inspiration since I was a little girl. The way she tells stories through her music, the emotion she brings to every performance, the strength she shows in the face of tragedy. She's everything I hope to become as an artist." The words hung in the air like a confession, and Sarah watched as Marcus's expression transformed from mere disapproval to something approaching genuine disgust. His laugh, when it came, was harsh and mocking, echoing through the auditorium with the cruel efficiency of a blade cutting through silk. "Reba McEntire," he repeated, savoring each syllable as if it left a bitter taste in his mouth. "Of course. Another small-town girl who thinks she can ride the coattails of outdated country music into relevance. Let me save you some time and embarrassment, sweetheart." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as Marcus stood up, his imposing figure casting a long shadow across the stage. The other judges remained silent, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the audition was taking, but unwilling to challenge Marcus's authority. Sarah realized with growing horror that she was about to become the victim of a public execution, her dreams offered up as sacrifice to one man's cruel ego. "Your musical taste is about as relevant as a horse and buggy in downtown Nashville," Marcus continued, his voice growing louder and more vicious with each word. "Reba McEntire represents everything that's wrong with country music. Outdated storytelling, melodramatic emotion, and the kind of backwards thinking that keeps this genre stuck in the past, while the rest of the music industry evolves into something actually worth listening to." The words hit Sarah like physical blows, each one designed to strip away another layer of her confidence and self-worth. She had expected criticism, had prepared herself for rejection, but this felt like something far more personal and devastating. This was not just an evaluation of her talent, but a systematic destruction of everything she believed about music and herself. "You stand up there," Marcus pressed on, clearly enjoying the power he wielded over Sarah's crumbling composure, "singing songs about dusty roads and broken dreams, just like every other wannabe country singer who thinks that imitating the past will somehow create a future. Well, let me give you a reality check that might save you years of wasted effort and disappointment." Sarah's hands began to shake as she gripped her grandmother's guitar, the familiar weight of the instrument suddenly feeling like an anchor, dragging her down into an ocean of humiliation. The stage lights, which had seemed warm and welcoming moments before, now felt harsh and exposing, illuminating every flaw and inadequacy that Marcus was so gleefully cataloguing for the entertainment of everyone present. "Country music is a business," Marcus declared, his voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence, "and businesses that refuse to adapt to changing markets inevitably fail. Artists who cling to the emotional manipulation and simplistic storytelling of singers like Reba McEntire are doomed to irrelevance. The industry has moved beyond tears and tragedy, beyond small-town values and outdated gender roles. Each word felt like another nail being hammered into the coffin of Sarah's dreams, but she forced herself to remain standing, even as her legs threatened to buckle beneath the weight of his assault. She thought of her grandmother, who had taught her to play guitar on this very instrument. She thought of the customers at Murphy's bar who had cheered for her performances night after night. She thought of everyone back home who was counting on her to prove that dreams could still come true. But as Marcus continued his verbal demolition, Sarah began to understand that this was about more than just her audition. There was something personal in his attack, something that went beyond professional criticism into the realm of genuine malice. He was not just rejecting her performance, he was attempting to destroy her faith in everything she had ever believed about music and its power to touch human hearts. "Your style, your influences, your entire approach to music," Marcus concluded, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than his shouting had, "represents the worst kind of artistic stagnation. You're not a singer, you're a museum exhibit, a relic of a time when country music was about feeling instead of thinking, about emotion instead of innovation." The auditorium fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different, charged with the electricity of injustice and the collective discomfort of witnesses to cruelty. Sarah realized that everyone in the room, from the other judges to the backstage crew, understood that they were watching something that went far beyond the normal boundaries of professional criticism. But Sarah also realized something else, something that would prove crucial in the moments to come. Hidden in the darkness beyond the judges' table, in the shadows where VIP guests and industry insiders observed the proceedings, a figure had been watching the entire exchange with growing anger and recognition. Someone whose own history with Marcus Holloway was about to collide with Sarah's present, in ways that would change both of their lives forever. As Marcus prepared to deliver what he clearly intended to be the final blow to Sarah's dreams, that figure began to move forward, stepping out of the shadows and into the light where her presence would transform everything that was about to happen. The click of designer boots against the polished floor echoed through the stunned silence like gunshots, each step deliberate and measured, carrying with it the weight of decades of hard-earned authority and carefully controlled rage. The sound made Marcus pause mid-sentence, his cruel smile faltering, as he turned toward the source of the interruption with the irritated expression of a man unaccustomed to being challenged during his moments of absolute power. When Reba McEntire stepped into the harsh stage lights, the entire auditorium seemed to hold its collective breath. At 59 years old, she moved with the confident grace of someone who had conquered every stage from the Grand Ole Opry to sold-out arenas across the world, her red hair catching the light like flames, and her emerald eyes blazing with an intensity that made even the most jaded industry veterans take notice. She wore a simple black dress that somehow managed to convey both elegance and authority, her presence transforming the entire energy of the room in ways that only true legends could achieve. Sarah's mouth fell open in disbelief as she recognized the woman who had been her inspiration since childhood, the voice that had carried her through her darkest moments and given her the courage to chase impossible dreams. But this was not the warm motherly figure Sarah had imagined from watching countless interviews and award shows. This was Reba McEntire in full protective mode, her famous smile replaced by an expression of barely controlled fury that seemed to crackle in the air around her like electricity before a storm. Marcus Holloway's face went through a rapid series of transformations as recognition dawned, shifting from irritation to surprise to something that looked suspiciously like fear. His confident posture began to crumble as memories of their last encounter, buried beneath years of professional success and carefully constructed arrogance, came flooding back with devastating clarity. He had not seen Reba since that catastrophic day in the recording studio over a decade ago, and he had convinced himself that she had forgotten his role in nearly destroying her career. "Well, well," Reba said, her Oklahoma accent thickening with emotion as it always did when she was truly angry. "If it isn't Marcus Holloway, still tearing down talented young women to feed his own pathetic ego. Some things never change, do they, Marcus?" The other judges exchanged bewildered glances, clearly sensing the history between these two titans of the music industry, but unable to comprehend the depth of animosity that seemed to fill the space between them. Rebecca Morrison leaned forward in her chair, her professional instincts recognizing that she was witnessing something far more significant than a simple disagreement about an audition. Dr. Hughes removed his glasses and cleaned them nervously, a gesture that revealed his discomfort with the sudden shift in the room's dynamics. Sarah remained frozen on the stage, her grandmother's guitar still clutched in her trembling hands, watching this confrontation unfold like a spectator at a tennis match between gods. She had dreamed of meeting Reba McEntire her entire life, but never in circumstances like these, never as the focal point of what was clearly becoming a reckoning between two people whose shared history was about to explode into the present with nuclear force. Marcus attempted to regain his composure, straightening his expensive tie and forcing his trademark smirk back onto his face, but the effect was like watching someone try to rebuild a house of cards during an earthquake. His voice, when he finally found it, carried none of the authoritative cruelty he had directed at Sarah moments before. "Reba," he said, her name emerging from his lips like a reluctant confession, "what a surprise to see you here. I didn't realize you were attending tonight's auditions. This is simply a professional evaluation of a contestant who, frankly, lacks the modern sensibilities necessary for success in today's market." Reba's laugh was sharp and cold, cutting through Marcus's attempt at professional deflection like a knife through paper. She stepped closer to the judges' table, her movements predatory and purposeful, and Sarah could see the way Marcus instinctively leaned back in his chair, as if trying to create distance between himself and the fury he had awakened. "Professional evaluation," Reba repeated, her voice rising with each word. "Is that what you call destroying a young woman's confidence and attacking her musical influences? Because from where I was standing, it looked a lot more like the same cruel power trip you tried to pull on me back in 1994. The year hit the auditorium like a thunderclap, and Sarah watched as Marcus's carefully constructed facade finally began to crack under the pressure of memories he had tried so desperately to bury. 1994 had been 3 years after the plane crash that had taken 8 members of Reba's team, 3 years into her painful process of rebuilding not just her career, but her entire relationship with music and performance. "That was different," Marcus stammered, his usual eloquence abandoning him as Reba's piercing gaze seemed to strip away every defense he had built around that period of his life. "That was business. We were trying to help you evolve your sound, to reach new audiences. You were stuck in the past just like this girl here." Reba's eyes flashed with a dangerous light that made Sarah grateful she was not the target of that legendary temper. The Queen of Country stepped even closer to Marcus, close enough that her voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout could have achieved. "Stuck in the past," she said, each word dripping with venom. "You mean stuck grieving for my friends who died in that plane crash? Stuck trying to honor their memory while you sat in that studio day after day, telling me my pain wasn't marketable, that my emotions were outdated, that everything I had built over 20 years of hard work was somehow beneath your artistic vision." The auditorium had become so quiet that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears like thunder. The other contestants, who had been waiting in the wings for their turn to audition, had crept closer to witness this unprecedented confrontation between two giants of the music industry. Camera phones began to appear in hands throughout the venue, capturing every moment of what was clearly becoming country music history. Marcus's face had gone pale beneath his expensive tan, and beads of sweat were beginning to form on his forehead, despite the cool temperature of the auditorium. He glanced around desperately, seeking support from the other judges or some escape from the memories that Reba was forcing him to confront, but found only hostile stares and uncomfortable silence. "I remember every single session," Reba continued, her voice gaining strength and authority with each revelation. "I remember how you would interrupt me in the middle of takes to tell me my delivery was too emotional. I remember how you dismissed every song I brought in as outdated melodrama. I remember how you made me feel like a failure when I was already drowning in grief and guilt over surviving when my friends didn't." Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes as she listened to Reba's raw confession, understanding for the first time the depth of tragedy that had shaped her idol's career. The plane crash had been public knowledge, but this behind-the-scenes torture at the hands of someone who was supposed to help her heal and grow was a revelation that made Sarah's own humiliation seem insignificant by comparison. "But most of all," Reba said, her voice rising to fill every corner of the auditorium, I remember the day you told me that maybe it was time for me to understand that my time had passed, that the plane crash was terrible, but using it as an emotional crutch wouldn't keep my career alive forever. Do you remember saying that, Marcus? Because I remember it word for word. The accusation hung in the air like a sword, and Sarah watched as Marcus seemed to shrink into his chair, his entire body language shifting from aggressive confidence to defensive terror. The other judges were staring at him with undisguised horror, clearly shocked by the revelation of his past cruelty toward one of country music's most beloved figures. I remember walking out of that studio, Reba continued, her voice becoming stronger and more passionate with each word, driving to my farm and sitting in my truck for 3 hours, seriously considering giving up music forever. I remember thinking that if someone with your reputation believed I was finished, then maybe I really was. I remember the darkest moment of my entire career, Marcus, and your face is burned into every second of it. Rebecca Morrison found her voice first, her professional demeanor cracking under the weight of what she was hearing. Marcus, is this true? Did you really say those things to Reba after everything she had been through? But before Marcus could formulate an answer, Reba held up her hand, commanding silence with the authority of someone who had earned her place at the top of the music industry through decades of talent, hard work, and resilience that went far beyond what most artists ever had to endure. What saved me, Reba said, her voice softening slightly as she turned to look directly at Sarah, was Dolly Parton. She heard about what was happening, showed up at my farm unannounced, and reminded me who I was and why my music mattered. She told me that bullies like Marcus survive by making others believe their lies, but they crumble the moment someone stands up to them with the truth. Sarah felt a surge of hope and recognition flowing through her chest as Reba's words began to weave a connection between past trauma and present purpose. She was beginning to understand that this confrontation was about more than just settling old scores. It was about preventing another talented young woman from suffering the same devastating blow that had nearly ended one of country music's greatest careers. Dolly was right, Reba continued, her gaze shifting back to Marcus with renewed intensity. Because here I am, 25 years later, still making music that matters to millions of people around the world, still telling stories that touch hearts and change lives, still proving every single day that emotion and authenticity will always triumph over whatever soulless garbage you call modern sensibility. Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but Reba was far from finished with him. She had waited over 2 decades for this moment, and she was going to make sure that every word she had swallowed in silence back then finally found its voice in defense of herself and every other artist he had tried to break. The stage was set for a confrontation that would not only determine Sarah's fate, but would also force the entire country music industry to confront some uncomfortable truths about power, respect, and the treatment of women in a business that had always been dominated by men who confused cruelty with strength. And now, Reba said, turning her full attention back to Sarah with a warmth that felt like sunlight after a storm, I want to hear this young woman sing without some broken-down bully interrupting her with his insecurities and failures. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat as she realized that Reba McEntire, her lifelong idol, was not just defending her, but actually requesting to hear her perform. The magnitude of the moment hit her like a physical force, and she had to grip her grandmother's guitar more tightly to keep her hands from shaking so violently that she couldn't play. Marcus attempted one last desperate grab for control, his voice cracking with the strain of trying to maintain authority in a situation that had completely spiraled beyond his influence. Now wait just a minute, Reba. This is my audition panel, and I have the right to evaluate these contestants according to professional standards that you may not understand or appreciate. The laugh that escaped from Reba's lips was so sharp and dismissive that several people in the auditorium actually flinched. She turned back to Marcus with the kind of predatory focus that had made her one of the most formidable businesswomen in Nashville. Her success built on a foundation of talent that was matched only by her refusal to be intimidated by men who thought they could use their positions to diminish her. Professional standards, she repeated, her voice dripping with contempt. Is that what you call the tantrum you threw in my recording sessions? Because I remember those professional standards, Marcus. I remember how you would sit in that producer's chair like some kind of musical dictator, stopping my takes every few bars to lecture me about how my emotional delivery was too intense for modern audiences. Rebecca Morrison and Dr. Hughes were now leaning forward in their chairs, completely captivated by this unexpected glimpse into one of country music's most closely guarded scandals. The revelation that Marcus Holloway, whose reputation was built on discovering and developing talent, had actually attempted to destroy Reba McEntire during one of the most vulnerable periods of her career, was sending shockwaves through everyone present. "I remember," Reba continued, her voice gaining momentum like a runaway train, "how you would play my vocals back and pause them at moments where you could hear real pain in my voice, telling me that grief wasn't sellable, that audiences wanted escapism, not authentic emotion. You told me that songs about loss and healing were self-indulgent, that my tribute to the friends I lost in that plane crash was nothing more than exploiting tragedy for commercial gain." Sarah watched as Marcus seemed to age 10 years in the span of minutes, his carefully maintained image crumbling under the relentless assault of memories he had tried so hard to bury. His expensive suit suddenly looked too big for his shrinking frame, and his hands trembled as he reached for the glass of water on the table before him. "But the worst part," Reba said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more power than any scream, "was how you made me doubt everything I believed about my own gift. You convinced me that the very qualities that had made me successful, my ability to connect with people's deepest emotions through music, were somehow flaws that needed to be corrected or eliminated entirely." The auditorium was so silent that Sarah could hear the air conditioning humming in the background, a mechanical soundtrack to one of the most extraordinary moments in country music history. She realized that she was witnessing not just a personal reckoning, but a moment that would ripple through the industry for years to come. "You spent 6 months trying to turn me into something I wasn't," Reba continued, her eyes never leaving Marcus's increasingly pale face. "You brought in songwriters who had never experienced real hardship, who wrote sanitized versions of country music that had all the emotional depth of elevator music. You hired session musicians who played with technical perfection but no soul, and then you wondered why nothing we recorded felt authentic." Dr. Hughes finally found his voice, his academic background compelling him to seek understanding even in the midst of this emotional maelstrom. "Marcus, these are very serious allegations. Did you really attempt to fundamentally alter Reba's artistic voice during such a difficult period in her life?" But Marcus seemed incapable of speech, his usual eloquence completely abandoned as the full weight of his past actions was laid bare before an audience of his peers and the very woman he had tried so hard to break. His breathing had become shallow and rapid, and beads of sweat were now clearly visible on his forehead despite the cool temperature of the auditorium. Reba stepped closer to the judges' table, close enough that she could have reached out and touched Marcus if she had chosen to, but her presence alone was more intimidating than any physical gesture could have been. When she spoke again, her voice carried the authority of someone who had survived everything the music industry could throw at her and emerged stronger than ever. "The day you told me that maybe my time had passed," she said, each word carefully chosen for maximum impact, "was the day I realized that you weren't trying to help me grow as an artist. You were trying to destroy me because my success, my authenticity, my ability to connect with real people through real emotions made you feel small and insignificant by comparison." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she listened to this raw confession from her idol, understanding for the first time the incredible strength it had taken for Reba to not just survive that period, but to emerge from it as one of the most successful and respected artists in country music history. The parallel between Reba's experience and her own humiliation at Marcus's hands was becoming impossible to ignore. "What you never understood," Reba continued, her voice growing stronger with each revelation, "was that country music isn't about impressing critics or following trends, or creating content that sounds like everything else on the radio. Country music is about truth, about telling stories that matter to people who work hard and love deeply, and sometimes get their hearts broken, but keep going anyway." Rebecca Morrison stood up from her chair, her business suit and professional demeanor unable to hide the fact that she was deeply moved by what she was witnessing. "Reba, I had no idea about any of this. The industry owes you an apology for what you endured, and I personally want to thank you for having the courage to speak out about it now." But Reba held up her hand, indicating that she wasn't finished with her confrontation with Marcus. She had carried the weight of this trauma for over 2 decades, and she was determined to see it through to its conclusion, not just for her own healing, but for every young artist who might face similar treatment in the future. "The only reason I didn't quit," Reba said, her voice breaking slightly as she remembered those dark days, "was because Dolly Parton showed up at my farm and reminded me that bullies like you count on good people giving up. She told me that every time an authentic artist walks away because someone convinced them they weren't good enough, the industry loses something precious that can never be replaced." Marcus finally found his voice, though it emerged as little more than a hoarse whisper. "Reba, I was young and ambitious. I thought I knew what was best for your career. I never meant to hurt you." The excuse hung in the air like smoke, and Reba's response came swift and merciless. "You weren't young, Marcus. You were 35 years old and already established in this industry, and you didn't think you knew what was best for my career. You thought you could remake me in whatever image would make you look like a genius to your peers." Sarah watched this exchange with growing amazement, realizing that she was witnessing one of the most powerful women in country music reclaim her narrative and refuse to let her abuser minimize or excuse his behavior. The courage it was taking for Reba to stand there and confront her past trauma in such a public way was inspiring Sarah to find her own voice in ways she had never imagined possible. "But here's what you really never understood," Reba said, her voice rising to fill every corner of the auditorium with the power and conviction that had made her a legend. "The very things you tried to destroy in me, the emotion, the authenticity, the refusal to compromise my artistic vision for commercial convenience, those were exactly the qualities that made my next album the biggest success of my career." The revelation hit the room like a lightning bolt, and Sarah could see the recognition dawning on faces throughout the auditorium as people began to connect the timeline Reba was describing with the massive commercial and critical success that had defined her career in the late 1990s. "Every song on that album," Reba continued, her eyes blazing with triumph, "was written from the pain you tried to convince me was unmarketable. Every emotion you told me was too intense became the foundation for music that spoke to millions of people around the world. Your failure to understand what country music really means became the catalyst for my greatest artistic achievement." Marcus slumped in his chair, completely defeated by the weight of evidence that his cruel treatment of Reba had not only been morally wrong, but had also been spectacularly misguided from a business perspective. The industry titan who had built his reputation on spotting talent and shaping careers had revealed himself to be nothing more than a bully whose insecurities had nearly robbed the world of some of its most beautiful music. But Reba wasn't finished yet. She turned back to Sarah, her expression softening with the kind of maternal warmth that had made her beloved by fans across multiple generations, and Sarah felt her heart soar with hope and possibility. "Now," Reba said, her voice gentle but determined, "I want to hear this young woman sing again, and this time, Marcus, you're going to sit there quietly and listen to what real talent sounds like when it's not being destroyed by someone who mistakes cruelty for expertise." Sarah's hands trembled as she adjusted the microphone stand, her heart pounding so hard she was certain everyone in the auditorium could see it beating through her chest. The weight of this moment was almost overwhelming, standing on the same stage where she had been humiliated just minutes before, but now with the protection and encouragement of her greatest musical hero. The transformation from despair to hope had happened so quickly that she felt dizzy with the emotional whiplash. Reba moved closer to the stage, her presence radiating warmth and strength that seemed to flow directly into Sarah's nervous system, calming her fears and reminding her why she had fallen in love with music in the first place. When their eyes met, Sarah saw something in Reba's expression that went beyond professional support. It was the look of one warrior recognizing another, one survivor reaching out to prevent someone else from falling into the same trap that had nearly destroyed her own dreams. "What's your name, honey?" Reba asked, her voice carrying the gentle Oklahoma accent that had comforted millions of fans through heartbreak and healing over the decades. "Sarah Jennings," she replied, her voice steadier now than it had been since stepping onto the stage. "I'm from Millerville, Texas, and I've been listening to your music since I was 5 years old. You taught me that country music could tell the truth about real life, even when that truth was painful." A smile spread across Reba's face, the first genuine warmth that had appeared in the auditorium since the confrontation began. "Well, Sarah Jennings from Millerville, Texas, I think it's time you showed everyone here what truth sounds like when it comes from the heart instead of being filtered through someone else's fear and insecurity." Sarah nodded, drawing strength from Reba's words and from the memory of her grandmother's hands, guiding her fingers across these same guitar strings during countless evenings on the front porch of their small house. She thought of Murphy's Bar, where working people came to forget their troubles for a few hours, and where her music had provided comfort and connection in ways that Marcus's clinical analysis could never understand or appreciate. "I'd like to sing a different song," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Something I wrote about my grandmother, who taught me to play guitar, and who always told me that music wasn't about impressing people. It was about touching their hearts and reminding them they weren't alone." Reba stepped even closer to the stage, close enough that Sarah could see the tears beginning to form in her eyes. "That sounds perfect, honey. And if you don't mind, I'd like to sing harmony with you. It's been too long since I've heard real country music in this building." The offer hit Sarah like a lightning bolt of pure joy and terror combined. The idea of performing with Reba McEntire, even for just one song, was beyond anything she had ever dared to dream. But more than that, she understood that this moment represented something far larger than her own career aspirations. It was about reclaiming the soul of country music from people who had forgotten what it was supposed to mean. Marcus started to protest from his seat at the judges' table, but Rebecca Morrison cut him off with a sharp gesture that left no room for argument. "I think we've heard enough from you for one evening, Marcus. This young woman deserves to be heard without interference." Dr. Hughes nodded in agreement, his academic perspective recognizing the historical significance of what was unfolding before them. "I believe we're witnessing something unprecedented here. Please, proceed." Sarah began to play, her fingers finding the chord progression for Grandmother's Hands, a song she had written during the lonely nights after her grandmother's funeral, when the silence in her small apartment had threatened to swallow her whole. The melody was simple but haunting, built on the foundation of old hymns and folk songs that had been passed down through generations of women who had found strength in music when life offered few other sources of comfort. As Sarah's voice began to weave the story of a woman who had raised 6 children during the Depression, who had sewn quilts by candlelight and sung lullabies that carried the weight of both sorrow and hope, something magical began to happen in the auditorium. The cynical atmosphere that had dominated the evening melted away, replaced by the kind of hushed reverence that only appears when people are confronted with genuine artistry. When Reba's voice joined Sarah's on the chorus, the effect was nothing short of transcendent. 2 generations of country music, separated by decades of experience, but united by the same fundamental understanding of what music could accomplish when it came from an authentic place, created harmonies that seemed to lift the entire room to a higher emotional plane. Grandmother's Hands knew how to comfort, knew how to heal, knew how to hold on when the world seemed to slip away, they sang together, their voices blending in ways that made it impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Grandmother's Hands taught me that love was stronger than fear, that hope could survive the darkest nights, that music could carry us home when we'd lost our way. Sarah could see people throughout the auditorium wiping tears from their eyes, even the hardened industry professionals who had thought they were immune to emotional manipulation. But this wasn't manipulation, it was the real thing, the kind of authentic connection between performer and audience that had made country music a vital force in American culture for nearly a century. As the song reached its bridge, Reba stepped back slightly, allowing Sarah's voice to carry the most personal verses alone while she provided gentle harmonic support that lifted rather than competed. It was a masterclass in generosity and professionalism, the actions of a true artist who understood that great music was about service rather than ego. "She taught me to play on this old guitar, showed me how 6 strings could hold a lifetime of stories, how 3 chords could carry more truth than a library full of books," Sarah sang, her voice growing stronger and more confident with each line. She said that music wasn't about being perfect, it was about being real, about sharing the parts of ourselves that connect us all as human beings. When the song ended, the silence that followed was different from any that had preceded it. This was not the uncomfortable quiet of witnessing cruelty or the tense anticipation of conflict, but the profound hush that comes after experiencing something truly beautiful, when words feel inadequate to capture the emotions that have been stirred. The first person to start clapping was Dr. Hughes, his academic reserve completely abandoned, as he rose to his feet in spontaneous applause. Rebecca Morrison followed immediately, her business suit unable to hide the fact that she had been deeply moved by what she had just witnessed. Within seconds, the entire auditorium was on its feet, offering the kind of standing ovation that comes not from politeness but from genuine appreciation for artistry that transcends commercial considerations. But the most meaningful response came from Marcus Holloway, who sat slumped in his chair, his face a mixture of shame and recognition as he finally understood what he had tried to destroy in both Reba and Sarah. The cruel confidence that had defined his interactions throughout the evening had evaporated completely, replaced by the hollow expression of someone confronting the full weight of their failures. Reba walked over to Sarah and embraced her, the gesture carrying the warmth of maternal pride and professional respect combined. "That," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium despite the continuing applause, "is what country music sounds like when it comes from the heart instead of a marketing committee." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she hugged her idol, the woman whose music had sustained her through the darkest periods of her life and whose courage in this moment had just transformed her future in ways she was only beginning to understand. But even in her joy, she was aware that something else was happening, something that went beyond her personal triumph. Throughout the auditorium, phones had appeared in hands, capturing every moment of this unprecedented performance and confrontation. The video of Reba McEntire defending a young artist and then performing with her was already beginning to spread across social media platforms, shared by people who recognized they had witnessed something special, something that reminded them why they had fallen in love with country music in the first place. Within hours, the footage would be viral, reaching millions of people around the world who would be moved not just by the beautiful music, but by the story of courage and redemption that had created it. Record labels would be calling Sarah's phone before she even left the building, but more importantly, young artists everywhere would see proof that authenticity could still triumph over cynicism, that there were still people in the industry willing to fight for what music was supposed to represent. But perhaps the most significant change was happening in Marcus Holloway himself, as he sat in his chair watching the celebration around him and finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what he had almost destroyed, not just in Reba's career or Sarah's dreams, but in his own soul. The realization that he had become everything wrong with an industry he had once genuinely loved was hitting him with devastating clarity. Rebecca Morrison approached the stage, her professional composure unable to hide her excitement about what she had just witnessed. "Sarah, that was extraordinary. I think I speak for everyone here when I say that we would love to discuss opportunities with you. But more than that, I want to thank you and Reba for reminding us what this business is supposed to be about." Sarah looked out at the faces in the auditorium, seeing hope and inspiration where there had been cynicism and calculation just an hour before. She understood that this moment had changed not just her own life, but potentially the trajectory of country music itself, proving that there was still an audience hungry for authentic emotion and genuine storytelling. As the applause finally began to die down, Reba took Sarah's hand and faced the audience together, two generations of female artists standing united against the forces that would diminish or exploit their gifts. The image would become iconic, a symbol of mentorship and courage that would inspire countless other women to stand up for their artistic vision and refuse to let anyone else define their worth or limit their potential. But even as Sarah basked in this incredible moment, she could sense that the story was far from over, that the confrontation with Marcus and the viral performance were just the beginning of changes that would ripple through her life and career in ways she couldn't yet imagine. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the wings of the Grand Ole Opry, her heart racing with the same nervous energy she had felt that night in Nashville, but this time the butterflies in her stomach were dancing with joy rather than terror. The sold-out crowd beyond the curtain was waiting to hear the young woman whose duet with Reba McEntire had become the most watched country music video in internet history, accumulating over 50 million views and sparking a nationwide conversation about authenticity versus manufactured celebrity in the music industry. The transformation of her life had been so rapid and overwhelming that Sarah sometimes felt like she was living in someone else's dream. Within 24 hours of that fateful audition, her phone had been ringing constantly with offers from record labels, booking agents, and media outlets wanting to tell her story. But through it all, Reba had remained her constant guide and protector, helping her navigate the treacherous waters of sudden fame while keeping her grounded in the values that had made their collaboration so powerful. The record deal she had eventually signed was unlike anything a new artist typically received, giving her complete creative control over her music and ensuring that no producer would ever have the power to diminish her artistic vision the way Marcus had tried to do with Reba. The contract had been negotiated personally by Reba's legal team, a gesture of generosity that went far beyond professional courtesy into the realm of genuine mentorship and protection. "Nervous?" Reba asked, appearing beside Sarah in the wings, wearing the same warm smile that had saved her career that night 6 months ago. She was scheduled to introduce Sarah to the Opry audience, an honor that carried deep significance in the country music world and represented the official passing of the torch from one generation to the next. "Terrified," Sarah admitted, clutching her grandmother's guitar with the same white-knuckled grip that had sustained her through that long-ago audition. "But it's a good kind of terrified, if that makes sense. The kind that comes from knowing you're about to do something that matters." Reba nodded, her understanding born from decades of experience with the unique pressure that came with performing on the most sacred stage in country music. "That's exactly the right kind of nervous. The day you stop feeling that electricity before a performance is the day you need to find something else to do with your life." As they stood together in the darkness, Sarah reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. Her debut single, Grandmother's Hands, had reached #1 on the country charts and crossed over to mainstream success in ways that surprised even the most optimistic industry predictions. But more importantly, the song had connected with people on a deeply personal level, generating thousands of letters from fans who shared their own stories of family, loss, and the healing power of music. The success had not come without its challenges. The media attention had been intense and sometimes intrusive, with reporters digging into every aspect of her background in search of scandal or contradiction. But Sarah had learned to handle the spotlight with grace, always remembering Reba's advice to stay true to herself and never let the business side of music corrupt the artistic passion that had brought her this far. Marcus Holloway's career, meanwhile, had taken a dramatically different trajectory. The viral video of his public humiliation had destroyed his reputation almost overnight, leading to his resignation from the judging panel and the cancellation of several high-profile production contracts. But in a twist that surprised everyone, including Marcus himself, the public disgrace had ultimately led to a period of genuine self-reflection and eventual redemption. 3 months after the incident, Marcus had published an open letter in Billboard magazine, taking full responsibility for his treatment of Reba and countless other artists over the years. The letter had been raw and honest, acknowledging the toxic masculinity and insecurity that had driven his cruel behavior, and expressing genuine remorse for the damage he had caused to careers and lives. More surprisingly, Marcus had followed up the apology by enrolling in therapy and anger management courses, determined to understand and change the patterns of behavior that had made him into the kind of person he had always claimed to despise. He had also begun volunteering at a non-profit organization that provided music education to underprivileged children, working to rebuild his relationship with music from the ground up. "You know," Reba said, interrupting Sarah's thoughts, "Marcus called me last week. He wanted to apologize again and to thank us for forcing him to confront what he had become. He's working with kids now, teaching them that music is about expression and joy, not about tearing others down to build yourself up." Sarah found herself genuinely moved by this update, recognizing that their confrontation had created ripple effects that went far beyond her own career success. The idea that Marcus was now using his experience to help nurture young talent, rather than destroy it, felt like a complete circle of redemption that validated everything they had fought for that night. "Do you think people can really change?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about Reba's perspective after everything she had experienced in her long career. "I think pain can either make us bitter or make us better," Reba replied, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had been tested by life in ways most people could never imagine. "The choice is always ours, but sometimes we need someone to hold up a mirror and show us what we've become before we can find the courage to choose differently." The stage manager appeared in the wings, signaling that it was almost time for their entrance. Sarah felt her pulse quicken, but this time the anticipation was pure excitement rather than fear. She thought about her grandmother, who had always believed that music was meant to bring people together rather than divide them, and she knew that tonight's performance would honor that legacy in the most meaningful way possible. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice boomed across the packed auditorium, "please welcome to the Grand Ole Opry stage the Queen of Country Music, Reba McEntire, and rising star Sarah Jennings." As they walked into the spotlight together, Sarah was struck by the thunderous applause that greeted them, a wall of sound that represented not just appreciation for their music, but recognition of the courage they had shown in standing up for artistic integrity. The audience included many of the same industry professionals who had witnessed their original confrontation, people whose respect had been earned through authenticity rather than politics. "Tonight," Reba said into the microphone, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the historic venue, "I want to tell you about the power of mentorship, about the importance of lifting each other up instead of tearing each other down, and about a young woman who reminded me why I fell in love with country music in the first place." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes as Reba recounted their story, not dwelling on the cruelty they had faced, but focusing instead on the strength they had found in standing together. The narrative had become legendary in Nashville circles, but hearing it told in this sacred space, with the full weight of country music history surrounding them, gave it an even deeper significance. 6 months ago," Reba continued, "Sarah Jennings was a waitress in Texas with a dream and a guitar that belonged to her grandmother. Tonight she's here because she never forgot that music is about touching hearts, not impressing critics. She's here because she had the courage to stay true to herself when it would have been easier to give up. And she's here because sometimes the best way to heal from our own pain is to make sure no one else has to endure what we endured." When Sarah took the microphone to perform, she chose to sing "Grandmother's Hands" one more time, but this version was different from any she had performed before. The song had evolved through months of live performances, gaining new layers of meaning and emotional depth as Sarah had grown into her role as an artist and advocate for authentic expression. As her voice filled the Opry House, Sarah could see faces in the audience that represented every level of the country music industry, from struggling songwriters to established superstars, all united in their appreciation for music that came from a genuine place. She understood that her success had opened doors for other artists who might have been dismissed or marginalized, and that responsibility felt both overwhelming and inspiring. The standing ovation that followed seemed to last forever, but eventually the crowd settled, and Reba returned to the microphone for one final announcement that would surprise everyone present, including Sarah herself. "Before we leave you tonight," Reba said, her voice filled with emotion, "I want to share something that Sarah doesn't know yet. Next month, we're launching the Grandmother's Hands Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to providing instruments, lessons, and mentorship opportunities to young artists from small towns and underserved communities across America." Sarah's mouth fell open in shock as she realized that Reba had been planning this surprise for months, working behind the scenes to transform their shared experience into a lasting legacy that would help countless other dreamers find their voices and pursue their passions. The foundation will be run by a board of artists, educators, and music industry professionals who believe that talent exists everywhere, but opportunity doesn't, Reba continued. "We want to make sure that the next Sarah Jennings doesn't have to work 3 jobs and save for years just to get a chance to be heard." The announcement triggered another wave of applause, but this time Sarah barely heard it because she was overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Reba was creating. The foundation represented everything they had fought for that night, transformed into concrete action that would impact real lives for generations to come. As they left the stage together, Sarah understood that her story was really just beginning. The viral video, the record deal, and even this triumphant performance at the Opry were just the opening chapters of a much larger narrative about the power of authentic artistry and the importance of creating opportunities for others to succeed. "Thank you," Sarah whispered to Reba as they reached the wings, the words carrying the weight of everything she couldn't express about how this incredible woman had changed her life. "Thank yourself," Reba replied, her eyes twinkling with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully passed on the most important lessons of her career. "You had the talent and the courage. I just made sure you got the chance to show it to the world." 6 months after a cruel producer had tried to destroy her dreams, Sarah Jennings had not only achieved everything she had ever hoped for, but had become part of a movement that would ensure future generations of artists would face fewer barriers and more support. The small-town waitress with her grandmother's guitar had grown into a voice for authenticity and compassion in an industry that desperately needed both. And somewhere in Nashville, Marcus Holloway was watching the Opry performance on television, tears streaming down his face as he witnessed the beautiful outcome of the painful confrontation that had forced him to examine his own soul and choose a better path forward. The redemption was complete, the circle was closed, and country music was stronger because people had found the courage to fight for what it was supposed to represent. The story that had begun with cruelty and humiliation had transformed into a testament to the power of standing up for what's right, lifting others up instead of tearing them down, and never forgetting that music at its best is about connecting human hearts across all the barriers that try to divide us.